Nekada ih se zvalo astralnim putovanjima, a danas izvantjelesnim iskustvima. Koje god ime koristili, niti jedno ne pokazuje svu začudnost tog neobičnog fenomena, kod kojeg subjektivno iskustvo pokazuje osobi da mu se očište odjednom našlo izvan njegova uobičajena mjesta, kod glave ili očiju. Osoba odjednom gleda samu sebe sa strane, odozgora, a može čak i putovati nekim inačicama svijeta koji poznaje. No kako to nimalo rijetko iskustvo uklopiti u ono što znamo ili mislimo da znamo o svijetu? Ta intrigantna tema ne prestaje inspirirati istraživače već skoro pola stoljeća. Proučavalo je se kroz povijest, teologiju, misticizam, psihologiju, neurologiju, neurokemiju, pa i fiziku. Kako i zašto nastaje izvantjelesno iskustvo i što nam ono govori o svijetu oko nas, zapitao se i Peake, autor knjige Izvantjelesno iskustvo. A mi smo ista pitanja postavili njemu ovdje, na rubu znanosti. Dobro večer. Peake, autor je nekoliko knjiga. Jedna od njih o kojoj ćemo večeras razgovarati je Izvantjelesno iskustvo. Dobro večer.
Good evening, hi.
Tema danas više nije toliko nova. Ponekad smo se doticali u svim mogućim pokušajima da se dokuči što leži u prirodi svijeta, a o tome najbolje pričaju takozvani neobični fenomeni. Kako bi se mogli definirati izvantjelesno iskustvo? To jest, što ga definira?
An out-of-body experience is a circumstance that you suddenly find yourself literally outside of your body. In other words, most of the time we experience the world through our eyes, through our ears and everything else, and we feel like we're located in some place a few inches behind our eyes. When somebody has an out-of-the-body experience, they suddenly realize that they are perceiving the world from outside of their body, from a location outside of their body. Now, this can either be slightly behind the head, or it can be actually looking directly at your own body. But effectively, it's a phenomenon that's been reported since time immemorial. In fact, the ancient Greeks used to talk about that there's very much something called the legend of that took place many, many years ago. I think Homer mentioned it. So it's something that's very, very common. The question is, what is it and what is really taking place?
Izvantjelesno iskustvo nikad u zadnjih 40 godina od Williama Bullmana nadalje nije prestalo intrigirati ljude i svakih 10 godina imamo sitne male korake prema naprijed. Večeras ćemo krenuti istim putem koji ste vi krenuli u knjizi, s obzirom da nam ova godina u kojoj jesmo ipak nakon 50 godina dopušta da napravimo jedan pregled pa da vidimo što su i sve kako ljudi pokušavali dokučiti i također koje su ponekad bile i njihove preoptimističke zamjerke ili pogreške u zaključivanju je li nešto dokazano kao fenomen ili nije. Na početku knjige spominjate i vlastito iskustvo sa nekakvim stimulatorom, LL stimulatorom. Kakve veze on ima sa izvantjelesnim iskustvima i što vam je to iskustvo pokazalo?
The LL stimulator, which we call Lucia, a lucid light device, has been invented by two Austrians, a guy called Engelbert Winkler, who is a consultant psychologist, and Dr. Dirk Prokol, who is a consultant neurologist. And both of them have come together to devise a machine that by using stroboscopic light and by using what's called the flicker phenomenon can actually bring about the sensation, at least, of an out-of-the-body experience. What in fact it does do, or what definitely seems to do, is place you into what's called a hypnagogic state. Now, the hypnagogic state is that kind of borderline region between asleep and awake that most of us experience just as we go to sleep, where we will see images of faces and everything else, or just before we wake up in the morning, which is called a hypnopompic experience. Now, what my two Austrian associates have done is they have pooled their resources and their knowledge base to devise this machine that you sit in front of it and you close your eyes and you get flickering light. So you have different intensities of white light and stroboscopic light. Now, I was given the opportunity to test this device around about 3 years ago by a friend of mine called Evelyn Elassa Vallerano, who lives in Zurich, in Switzerland. And she invited me over to test the machine out. Now, I'm somebody that I'm very, very keen to understand exactly what's going on in regards to the human brain. But effectively, lots of experiences that other people have, I haven't had, so I haven't experienced these things. So I was really intrigued to see whether this could automatically generate an out-of-the-body experience or something different that I'd never experienced before. So I sat in front of the light and I closed my eyes, and all you can see is kind of flickering light in front of your eyes. And after about 3 or 4 minutes, nothing had happened. And I was thinking to myself, this is going to be very difficult to explain to the guys that nothing's happened. You know, I was thinking, how on earth they've invited me over and there's nothing taking place. And as I was thinking about this, suddenly, in my extreme right field was a flash of blue light that actually came right across my visual field. At the same time, this side of my visual field, a red light came across, and the two of them mingled in the middle and started to spin. Now, effectively, as soon as I started perceiving this, I thought, this is like the classic near-death experience, the tunnel effect that is reported by people, you know, researchers in the subject. This intrigued me, and I turned round and I said, have you changed the colour of the lights in some way? And they said, no, they're still white. What's happening is your brain is starting to now engage with the light patterns. I then found that my eyes and my head started to vibrate, which was quite disconcerting. And I was told, no, this is a physiological effect as the light starts to encode the shimmering. As I was doing this, I then noticed in my extreme periphery vision, now I was sitting in a chair like this, and in my extreme periphery vision down here somewhere, there was a kind of a movement, for want of a better word. Now, I suffer from what's called classic migraine. And classic migrainers and members of your audience who have this will know that you actually have a breakdown in your visual field, a kind of a shimmering. It's called a scotoma. I could feel or see a scotoma down here. And I said to the Austrian doctors, could I move my head and look at what I was seeing, because I'd be looking away from the light? And they said, yes, you can now, because your brain has encoded the light, so you move away. And I turned round and I looked down, and even to this day, I cannot believe what I saw. It was literally the classic astral plane. I was as if I was floating 15, 20 miles above the surface of a planet. I could see the edge of the planet and the curve of the planet with blue shimmering lights along its side. And along the lines of the planet was like a checkerboard, like a chessboard, and there were blue lights shimmering up and down. Now, I've only subsequently discovered that Carlos Castaneda had a term which he called, I think, the lights of the world, which was one of the things that they say that shamans see. Well, I was actually seeing this in my own mind's eye, in a living room in Zurich. I was so amazed by this that I stared at it, and then I moved away. And I started looking back at the light, seeing if the pictures would still stay. And then what happened was that I felt as if my hands and my legs were moving, as if I was bouncing up and down. And I turned round to my associates and I said, am I jumping up and down? And they said, no. I could feel my hands moving out of my hands and my legs moving out of my legs. And I was feeling like I was rising. I have to admit, I then lost my nerve and I asked them to switch it off, because the whole thing was just so different to anything I'd ever experienced before. Subsequently then, when I then spoke to them afterwards, and as I was having a chat with them, the most bizarre effect then started, because I started to feel a vibration in the centre of my head here. And it was like a small animal was moving underneath here. And it continued for the rest of the evening, this kind of buzzing sensation and buzzing feeling. Now, what Winkler and Procol, and one of the ideas I discuss in this book and in my next book, is the idea that what this does is it actually generates dimethyltryptamine within the pineal gland of the brain. In other words, it activates the third eye in some way. And what you're seeing when you're in these states is, in fact, an alternate universe, for want of a better term. And I believe when your body starts, when you have the sensation of moving out your body, you're actually moving intradimensionally into another dimension of reality, another vibrational level of reality. And this machine seems to stimulate it.
Knjigu i počinjete s jednim zaključkom, i u redu nakon toliko godina istraživanja tih područja od strane raznih autora početi u stvari sa zaključkom da zapravo možda ne treba ići za time je li izvantjelesno iskustvo stvarno ili zamišljeno, već ovo što i govori vaše iskustvo, treba istraživati prirodu opažaja, a naravno time i prirodu pojavnog svijeta za koji nam osjetila govore da je vrlo stvaran, ali nije to baš toliko stvarno koliko se čini. Drugim riječima, izmijenjena stanja svijesti su subjektivno stvarna iskustva i svijest na izgled, dakle, u svom iskustvu može izići iz tijela. Pa sad nameće se zapravo klasično pitanje što je to svijest. Svima se čini da ima više veze sa glavom nego s nogama, ali ništa nije dalje od te pretpostavke. Koja je to klasična dilema kada se danas priča o svijesti, kad se nalazimo na ovom razmeđu gdje se dvije paradigme susreću? Jedna jako drevna je u biti jako nova i druga na koju smo na neki način naviknuti u zadnjih desetljeća i stoljeća.
I think one of the major problems we have here is we are trying to question a reality or trying to understand the reality. We were asking the wrong questions, and our model seems to be completely confused here, in the sense that one normally argues about the concept of duality, the idea that there is a material universe, and existing somewhere as an epiphenomenon of that material universe is consciousness. In other words, the idea that consciousness suddenly occurs as a part of the evolutionary process within the brain. Now, the question with this is, how on earth can consciousness in any shape or form be an epiphenomenon of brain activity? The reason being that consciousness doesn't have extension in space. It doesn't have a physical, measurable, tangible reality. So the question is, how can inorganic and organic chemicals, a soup inside the brain, and electrical impulses bring about the concept of you and me, and the idea of our hopes, our fears, our dreams, our anticipations? All of these things are inside our head, supposedly. Now, David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher, has actually called this the hard problem of science, because science cannot bridge that gap of how it is that consciousness occurs in the brain. Now, the question then is, if consciousness does exist, and there are certain people called eliminative materialists who will argue that even consciousness doesn't exist, this is a delusion. People like Daniel Dennett will argue that you and I, when we think we are conscious referential beings, we are not. We're fooling ourselves. It's something he calls the Cartesian theatre. But the reality of it is that consciousness, we know empirically, using the word empirical in its literal term, which is from experience, the only thing we know to be a follower of Descartes here is that we are, and we think and we perceive. What we perceive as the external world is presented to consciousness by our senses. Our brain processes that consciousness and presents it to a little homunculus in the head, a little man that views the world. This is the way we think it is. This actual idea is generally known as naive materialism, the idea that somehow out there is real and inside is somehow not real. I turn it on its head and I say that both external reality and the internal inner world of reality are both aspects of the same thing. They're both aspects of what particle physicist David Bohm would call the implicate order. The idea that at a deeper level of reality, everything is a unity, everything is the same thing. Therefore, to say that under certain circumstances I can travel in three-dimensional reality outside of my body is not really the question to ask. The question to ask is, if I have these experiences, what am I experiencing and where am I physically located when I go in them?
Koliko postoji znanstvenih radova o izvantjelesnom iskustvu prema vašem istraživanju na temelju kojih ste zapravo i pisali knjigu? U kojoj mjeri ta tema zanimala istraživače i u kojoj mjeri su objavljivani radovi o njima?
Many papers have been written on it, particularly in recent years, because there is this great intrigue as to how we get the sensation of being outside of our body. There have been various experiments done whereby you can, and I think how it works is you place a camera behind somebody's head, and then they wear goggles, and inside the goggles they have the vision from the camera's point of view. And what will then happen is the person, because of the way consciousness works and the way we see ourselves somatically, we will place ourselves mentally into the image we see in front of ourselves, and we will perceive reality from that image in front of ourselves, which effectively means that we perceive our location in space because of what our senses tell us. I've always used the analogy, for instance, that we perceive that we're located in our head purely and simply because our eyes are in our head and our ears are in our head. If my eyes and ears were on my kneecap and my ears were on the sides of my knee, I would genuinely believe that I was located in my knee. So therefore, the illusion that we're located in our head is purely and simply because of the way our senses function. Now, a lot of other papers have been written on the idea of it's to do with doppelganger syndrome, the idea that you will physically see your own double in front of you. It's something that's reported regularly in schizophrenia, where individuals will see somebody outside themselves. There's also a technical term called hoitoscopy. Now, effectively, This is not necessarily an explanation for this, because there have been well-documented cases where individuals, particularly during the near-death experience, seem to perceive reality from somewhere located outside of their head. I cite, for instance, a very famous case, the Pam Reynolds case in the USA, where this woman her brain had literally been brought to what's called standstill. It was actually, her brain was, I think, down to 60 degrees, and there was no brain activity. They were going to do a particular operation on an inoperable brain tumour, but she effectively found herself outside of her body looking over the shoulder of the surgeon, and she described the device that the surgeon used to cut into her head. Now the question is, was it because she was outside of her body, or was this some form of confabulation that was pulled together after she became conscious after the operation, like a dream sequence, that she'd subliminally picked this information up and created this illusion around it? But effectively, the scientific papers are regularly written, but somehow for me they miss the point. They really do miss the point.
Najčešće se izvantjelesna iskustva i mogu skupljati samo kroz zapise o subjektivnim iskustvima. Recimo, spomenut ću Amerikanku Susan Siegel iz vaše knjige, koja se tako našla odjednom izvan tijela, pokraj sebe, gledala se kako ulazi u autobus. Zbog toga jer je ona to svoje stanje opisala kao jedan oblak svjesnosti, što je svakako dosta zanimljiv i znakovit izraz. Pišete u knjizi također da modeli velikih svjetskih tradicija obuhvaćaju ta stanja i nekako mijenjate izraz iz izvantjelesno iskustvo u egzosomatsko putovanje. Zbog čega?
Why is it that they are around the world and why they are so common? Well, I think it is to do with how the brain functions, and indeed how the brain perceives the reality around it. I use the example of something that a lot of people report. You know, I was mentioning this hypnagogic state just before you go to sleep. Lots of people, when they're in these states, experience something called false awakenings. And what they do is they wake up, they walk across the room, and they will go to the bathroom, they will go downstairs, and they will find themselves back in their body again. And they'll wake up again, and they'll do the same thing. There was one young man, I was doing a radio program in the UK, and one guy rang up and said that he'd had a series of false awakenings, and he'd had about 10 or 11 of them in succession. And each time he'd got further into the day. And by the last one, it was mid-afternoon, and he was at work, and he looked out the window and he thought, there's something strange here, and boom, he was back in bed again, waking up. Now this shows to me that our model of reality, we model the world around us, because I know, for instance, I have an idea what's around my head, I have an idea what is around this room. If I feel a sensation that my mind is leaving my body in some way, I will model in my own mind where I would be in three-dimensional space. And this is a skill we all have. The question is, when we do that, is it this physical reality we move to? Now, you mentioned earlier on about the work of Robert Monroe. Now, if you read a lot of Robert Monroe's books, you will find that one of the things he describes in his books is something called locale 3. And by locale 3, what Robert Monroe means is a reality you go to when you're in an out-of-the-body experience that is this reality, but not quite. There's something not quite right about it. There's something different. Now, you mentioned Bullman as well. All the people that actually regularly experience out-of-the-body experiences and train people will always say that there's something different about the reality you move to. The walls will be a different colour, the carpet will be a different colour. It seems to be a facsimile world that we move within. Now, if this is the case, as I argued before, is our brain is attuning to subtle differences in the field, for want of a better term, the field of consciousness that's all around us, and we just move within these fields. Now, this would explain phenomena like lucid dreaming, where individuals have a dream, and in that dream sequence, they become self-aware and conscious of the fact they're dreaming, and they can manipulate the reality within the dream, as if you're having this genuine dream. I mean, it's very much, it's a theme of many, many movies over recent years. Inception, for instance, is a classic example of this.
Kada pričamo o usporedbama starih znanja i novih, spomenuli ste Roberta Monroea, koji je bio jedan poslovni čovjek koji je počeo doživljavati svoje iskustva, napisao knjigu u kojoj je čak svoje iskustva podijelio u lokalitete 1, 2 ili 3, mogli bismo reći po odmaku od stvarnosti, tako bih recimo nekako posložio. U isto vrijeme, kada se govori o drevnim putnicima, koji su također dolaze iz tradicija šamanskih i religija, oni također dosljedno, iznenađujuće dosljedno opisuju te svjetove astralnih ravni. Primjerice, šamani putuju u više svjetove, niže, sreću tamo duhove, demone, učitelji im pomažu proći kroz neka vrata, sreću bića koji imaju svoje motive, kao da nisu proizvod njihove svijesti, nego kao da je to netko ko zaista tamo negdje postoji. Koje su to paralele koje možemo povući između svih tih šamanskih opisa? Baš sam se zadržao na šamanskim, oni su nekako najdirektniji s obzirom da su ovi koji su provučeni kroz filter religijskih knjiga već pomalo dobili druge naslage. Ali ovo su znači iskustva ljudi koji su to imali, ispričali su ih, a u isto vrijeme imamo Roberta Monroea koji je jedan od pionira istraživanja izvantjelesnih iskustava. Nije bio šaman, nego tu naš čovjek svjetovni. I kakve su tu paralele i što možemo naučiti iz tih dva iskustava, možda neku objektivizaciju izvući?
Uncannily accurate is the words I would apply to that. In that if you look at the shamanic experience, as you say, there's the upper and lower worlds that they experience, which is effectively what Robert Monroe experienced. And Robert Monroe, one has to believe, knew nothing about these particular shamanic belief systems. And again, the shamanic belief systems, if you look at them, they are consistent around the world. There is this standard idea that there are places you can go, and when you go to these places, you will encounter other beings, and other beings you will look for your totem animal. When you're actually out as a shaman, when you're actually in one of these environments, a creature will come to you, and this creature will be your guide. This creature will be something that will help you. And it is clear that when we go to these places, we do seem to encounter other entities that have motivations that are different to our own. I'll cite the example, for instance, of Robert Waggoner, who is a writer on lucid dreaming, and he trains people in lucid dreaming. And he has noticed on occasions when he's been lucid dreaming, for instance, there was one time when he imagined he was flying over a load of people with tall hats. And for fun, he started knocking the hats off the people. And as he was going along, one of the people in his dream sensed him coming and put his hand on the hat to stop him doing it. Now, that was motivation that was external to him, which led him to believe that the beings you encounter in these circumstances are, in fact, other beings. Now, on top of that, there are cases where individuals have been in out-of-the-body experiences, and I cite, for instance, the example of Tom Campbell, who was one of Robert Monroe's scientists. It was a group of scientists that worked with Robert Monroe. And Campbell has cited many occasions where he shared out-of-the-body experiences in another place with other people. In fact, in his book, My Big Toe, he actually cites examples where he met his own son in these other places, and people come back and they report the same things. Now, if that is the case, it begs some interesting questions, because the only reason that you and I consider this reality to be a real reality is because it's consensual, in the sense that you and I both agree that this is a studio and everything is located in the right places. If we turn around and we look back again, everything's in the same place. If you and I then go into a dream state, and we come back from this dream state and we both report we've seen the same things, that is exactly the same way we define reality. So in which case, that by its very nature is proof that the alternate realities are just as real as these are. Neurologists and psychologists will turn around and say that's something called a folie à deux. The idea that somehow the two of us have fooled each other into believing we shared an experience. Well, how nonsensical. In which case, if you extrapolate from that, it's logical to conclude that we're all fooling ourselves into a shared experience within three-dimensional reality in exactly the same way.
U knjizi niste mogli ne dotaknuti srodna iskustva koje u stvari predstavljaju izvantjelesno iskustvo. To su danas već slavna iskustva bliska smrti, dakle near death experience, također istraživanja remote viewinga o kojima već u ovoj emisiji jednom i drugom u više navrata bilo riječi, tako da je ljudima već danas bliska ta tema. Međutim, one što daje nekakvu autentičnost i jedno zanimljiva pitanja vezana uz iskustva bliska smrti koja su, kao što znamo, potekla od knjiga Raymonda Moodyja koji je prvi put skupio te stvari u jednu knjigu, a danas već imamo i Nizozemca Pina van Lommela koji je proveo dosta istraživanja, jedan kardiolog iz Nizozemske koji je praktički napravio prva prava nekakva statistička istraživanja. Međutim, Spominjete doktoricu Janice Holden koja se bavila kvalitetama vizija i također se u njenom kontekstu spominju iskustva bliska smrti kod slijepih osoba. Znači kod osoba koje nemaju vid od rođenja, koje nikad nisu ništa vidjela, nemaju vizualnu bazu podataka, niti ikakvo iskustvo boja, niti ičega. Što se tu događa i što nam ta iskustva mogu reći o toj misterioznoj prirodi stvarnosti oko nas?
The concept of blind NDEs is indeed intriguing. There's a lady called Vicky Umapeg who was born blind and had a near-death experience. I think she had 2 near-death experiences. And in the near-death experiences, she claimed that she could see. And she claimed she could see around herself. And I think she even noticed something about herself, either something to do with her operation she'd had or something, which was intriguing. Now, if this is the case and blind people can see when they are having a near-death experience, what are they seeing with? In other words, if Vicky's visual systems did not work, she was seeing with a form of light that wasn't external light. In other words, her brain or her visual pathways were being stimulated by another form of light that was not external to her. If that is the case, what world was she seeing there? Now, there is an argument to say, and I know there is this position that's taken by certain people in terms of blind cases such as Vicky and the other one cited, I think it was it by Ring, I think, is that it's a confabulation. In other words, there's an argument to say that blind people can dream. And blind people will dream creating a world of their dreams in which they think is visually correct. But the difficult question would be, how would a blind person, for instance, a blind person says, I saw blue. In my dream, I saw blue. How would a blind person explain to a sighted person that they could see blue? Because there's no overlap of reference that they can use. So it's very difficult to say whether what these people were seeing was a physical reality or not. But I tend to believe that what is happening is they're tuning into another form of light. And they're seeing another form of light. And that form of light is the form of light that shamans see. That's the form of light that people see when they have ayahuasca trips, dimethyltryptamine trips. This is an inner light. It's actually formed by things called biophotons. This is light that actually comes up from the cells themselves, out from the DNA. And this is a light that illuminates dreams. It illuminates thoughts. And I think this is a very intriguing route that we could follow in terms of the whole out-of-the-body experience, is what does this tell us about how perception works and functions.
Izvantjelesno iskustvo, nažalost, se suočilo s poteškoćama kad su ga pokušali dokazivati na objektivne načine. Naime, nije problem napraviti jedan zamišljeni pokus. Ako neko izlazi iz tijela, dovoljno je staviti na nekakva mjesta koja su nama u ovom trenutku nevidljiva, na vrhu ormara ili negdje, karte, predmete, brojke i neko bi to trebao pročitati. Kod mnogih istraživača koji su istraživali, da kao dr. Charles Start, a i drugi, vidljiva je kao prvo jedna želja i jedna sklonost, tema ih je uvukla, oni su osjetili da ovdje ima nešto. Kad su pokušavali doista vidjeti i spojiti ta iskustva, je li netko tko je imao izvantjelesno iskustvo i posjetio nekog drugog kod kuće, točno upisao ko je bio kod njega, što je radio, kako je bio obučen, najčešće tu, ili vidjeti brojke na početku, na vrhu ormara, tu najčešće nije baš to jako dobro uspijevalo i taj dio priče je zauvijek nekako ostao nedorečen i kritičari bi se pravo mogli reći, kao što ste vi rekli, zapravo objektivno dokazano nije. Naravno, stvar uopće nije toliko jednostavna, upravo zbog toga što ta cijela stvarnost koju ti ljudi posjećuju jest kao ova, ali baš i nije. Malo je drugačije boje, oblika i slično. Koje su bile u knjizi vaše te zamjerke, s kojim problemima su se suočavali istraživači i kako su ih uopće pokušavali nadvladati i koliko su bili u svojim težnjama iskreni?
Some of the major problems I had was that if there are many people that claim they can automatically get outside of their body and either they can remote view or they can go into the next room and see things. Now, for me, if that is the case and I can get out of my body automatically, it would imply that I could move out of this studio and you could place something in a studio over there and I could walk into that studio and I could tell you with absolute certitude what I saw in exactly the same way as I would be able to do in consensual reality. However, there are no cases that I am aware where an individual who has claimed to be able to do this has been able to repeat this. I know, for instance, there's a very, very famous case, I think it's the Miss Z case, that Charles Tart, there was a lady that Charles Tart worked with, where she was able to identify, I think, a 6-figure number that had been placed somewhere above head height within the room she was in. However, there was no witnesses in that room to say that she hadn't actually got up, taken the electrodes off and just looked at it. It's not as if there was anybody in the room with her. So you have to beg questions about that. You also have to beg questions that, despite considerable amount of work, as you mentioned, Jan Holden has done work on this, Bruce Grayson has done work on this, Sam Parnia has done work with this at the Southampton Hospital in the UK. In fact, there's been a large area of research that's been done over recent years called the Aware Project, whereby they have actually placed, I think, either computer terminals or something in crash rooms when people have had cardiac arrests. Now, the idea is you float above your body and you will actually see computer screens with kind of random figures or numbers on them, but nothing has ever been succeeded in this. Now, people genuinely believe they are having these experiences. So the question to me is, are they just simply delusions? But if they are delusions, they are incredibly powerful delusions. And of course, we then got to go back one step and say, define an illusion, define a hallucination. You know, if an hallucination is real to you, and you share it with somebody else, it is therefore real. So there has been, you know, I think that we will keep trying to find proof of the out-of-the-body experience in consensual reality, but I think we'll continue to fail because we'll never get it quite right. You know, for instance, Charles Tart's experiments with Robert Monroe. Charles Tart moved out to California, where Robert Monroe was still living in Virginia, and Robert said that I would try and visit you, Charles, in your new house in California, and I will ring you and let you know when I've done it. And indeed, Monroe did manage to get to Charles Tart's new house. The problem was that he got 75% of the room right, but the actual position of the furniture and the colour of the walls and everything else was wrong. So it again leads you to believe that we seem to live in these kind of overlapping universes where things are just not quite right. You know, the people who travel and do remote viewing, it's the same there. Remote viewing had some amazing successes, but there were some amazing failures as well. And even the really top-notch people like Ingo Swann, you know, if you actually look consistently at what he came back with, he was never 100% right. His drawings were vaguely accurate, but not 100%. And I think that's the route we need to follow and find out why.
Da, kod remote viewinga je poznat taj problem odnosa signala i šuma. Kad vidite metu nacrtanu, vi vidite da je to ta meta. Međutim, ako pokušate iz samog crteža pogoditi o čemu se u stvari radi, vrlo često nećete to biti u stanju. Na sličan način, kao što ste pričali o toj nedorečenosti i u tom nekom čudnom postotku pogađanja i nepogađanja, postojali ljudi koji su pokušali nadići taj problem. Konkretno, u Brazilu je napravljena Međunarodna akademija svijesti, a brazilski liječnik Valdoviera je napravio jednu stvarno opsežnu knjigu. Nju spominjate 1232 stranice. Ne želim ni razmišljati koliko je teška. Pregleda izvantjelesnih iskustava i također je uveo jednu novu znanost, tako je on to nazvao, znanost o svijesti, projekciologija. I također je napravio knjigu 700 pokusa koscijentologije. E sad, tu smo da objasnimo što se zbivalo u Brazilu, što se zbivalo u Portugalu, što je to projektarijum i kako su uopće pokušavali ljudi istraživati u Brazilu i Portugalu autentičnost izvantjelesnih iskustava.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued with the work that Waldo Vieira and his associates are doing in the International Academy of Consciousness. And indeed, I've actually visited their offices in London. And I was hoping at one stage, when the research of this book, that I would be able to get down to the projectarium and everything else down in Portugal, where they have this university campus where they're doing experiments on this. Because if you actually read a lot of Waldo Vieira's work, what you'll find is Waldo in many ways and his associates very much agree with the point of view I'm taking. For instance, there's one case where Waldo visits his sister in Belo Horizonte, and I think he was living down in Rio, and Belo Horizonte is much further north. And he claimed that he visited his sister in a dream state and spoke to her and had a whole conversation with her. The interesting thing is that even by his own admission, His sister didn't remember him having that conversation, although at the same token he was able to identify the house that his sister lived in, and I think the location of a car and a light outside the house, which he didn't know. So then there's the curious situation of how was it that clearly he was physically in some place that was a facsimile of where his sister was. By the same token, he felt he'd spoken to his sister, but his sister didn't remember the fact he'd spoken to her. Now again, there's this kind of mismatch of information that is clearly accurate, but there's the other part of the information that clearly isn't. And I'm very keen to work closely with a lot of these guys in work of what they're doing, because I think it's only by objectively looking at the facts that we're going to come to some proper conclusions about this. There's no point in doing wishful thinking and hoping that this is evidence of out-of-the-body experiences. We need to do the science, because there is something here, and it's of profound significance for all of us, because it does suggest that if we can exist and perceive outside of the brain, this effectively means that consciousness is not restricted to the brain. And if consciousness is not restricted to the brain, it means effectively that we are not our body. And if we're not our body, that then begs some fascinating questions about the nature of consciousness.
Danas već postoji nekoliko modela koji pokušavaju objasniti izvantjelesno iskustvo. Svi se oni negdje prije ili kasnije susreću na istim mjestima. Čovjek za kojeg ja prije recimo nisam čuo, a pročitao sam u vašoj knjizi, Tom Campbell, je rekao da svako ima teoriju svega. To je jedna stvarno zanimljiva i za razmišljanje misao. Dakle, svako ima neku stvarnost filtriranu iskustvima, obrazovanjem i filter koji ograničava poimanje mnogih razina. Što je on zapravo time htio reći i kakve to veze ima sa izvantjelesnim iskustvima?
Tom's ideas and Tom's philosophy and Tom's science is simply fascinating. Because what Tom is basically arguing is that we are existing in, for want of a better term, a kind of a shared computer program. Effectively, an encoded reality that is the backdrop of everything. And we share this reality. But, and this is the important point, is this reality is local to ourselves. In other words, I use my senses to create the world around me. Now, most people will turn around and say, utter nonsense. And as Einstein said, the moon, I cannot believe the moon doesn't exist if I don't look at it. But the irrefutable proof of this is something called the twin slit experiment. And effectively, without going into detail, it effectively means that if you are not observing or measuring a subatomic particle, it is a probability wave. It is a probability of being something somewhere. If you then look at it or observe it, the probability wave turns into a point particle. For instance, if you have a box full of free electrons, there is a statistical chance that an electron can be in any position in that box. Statistically, the chances of it being slightly outside the box are infinitesimally small, but are still a possibility, whereas inside the box you think you know where you might find it. But until it's observed, that particle hasn't chosen where to be. Now, this again is an observed phenomenon. It's observed time and time again. For instance, some quantum computing is actually being used upon this idea of particles being outside of places, so it's something we're using all the time. But the interesting thing with this is the ultimate suggestion is that reality is created by the act of observation of a conscious mind. Of course, we have to define exactly what we mean by conscious. Now, I won't go into details about famous thought experiments like Schrödinger's cat, but these are all things that suggest that the reality we see is not the real reality. It's created by the mind. Now, there is a guy called Max Tegmark who is, I think, at Princeton University. He's a Danish quantum physicist, and he's come up with something called the quantum suicide experiment, which actually suggests, and get this, and remember this is a guy, one of the world's leading quantum physicists, and he said he can prove by applying quantum physics that in fact death is an impossibility for any one individual, because your universe needs you to continue observing it. So therefore you cannot die in your observed universe, which is intriguing stuff. And again, what I suggest to people out there is just look up Tegmark quantum suicide. It's quite intriguing. I cite this in my first book. But it's intriguing stuff because what it actually is telling us is that this out here is some form of hologram, and it's being processed by the brain, which in turn seems to have holographic elements to it. For instance, the idea of where memory is located in the brain. People like Carl Lashley spent years trying to locate what he called the engram, the location of memory in the brain. Carl Pribram worked on this as well, as we both are aware of. Now, the thing with this is, if memory is located all over the brain, the only way this can work is it's done holographically. And if the external reality, as David Bohm said, is holographs, what we have is in fact a hologram processing a hologram. And that's pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, because this is now getting profoundly weird as to what the true nature of reality is.
Izvantjelesno iskustvo svakako vodi u razne smjerove, od psihologije, neurologije, fizike koju ste spominjali, čak i do pitanja veze elektromagnetizma i iskustava izvan tijela, no također i do činjenica da se mnoga izmijenjena stanja svijesti danas mogu stvarati unošenjem određenih biljaka koji u sebi sadrže tu molekulu DMT, koju neko zove Božjom molekulom, što je jednostavnije reći nego njen puni naziv. No, ona sama za sebe zapravo ne bi morala puno značila kad mi ne bismo imali taj jedan organ epifiza, se zove, koji također je vrlo neobičan, nije uparen, čini se da se može smanjivati ili rasti tijekom života, ovisno o načinu kako ga održavamo, da tako kažemo. Što se u vezi sa DMT-em i epifizom može ustanoviti, recimo na temelju opsežnih knjiga koje je napisao Rick Strassman, konkretno riječ o knjizi Duhovna molekula, kakvi su bili pokazatelji, eksperimenti? To je još jedan trag i jedna mala vrata u neke druge razine stvarnosti koje nas vode izvan tjelesna iskustva.
The work of Rick Strassman is fascinating in the extreme. Rick Strassman managed to get financial support from the American government in the early 1990s at the University of New Mexico to do a series of experiments with volunteers taking various doses of dimethyltryptamine. Now, dimethyltryptamine is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, hallucinogenic drug known to man. In fact, it tends to be called an entheogen. It's something that actually helps you almost encounter God. Now, what is intriguing about dimethyltryptamine is the way in which it creates a sensation when you take it of flying outside of your body and being located somewhere else outside of your body. And when you're outside of your body, you experience other beings and you encounter other beings. And these beings, again, seem to have their own self-motivations. Now, what is intriguing about the reports that Rick's subjects did is that the beings that they describe seem to be very, very similar to the classic idea of the Greys. You know, and if you look at the similarities between the experiences of people who have been abducted and the experiences reported by Rick Strassman's people, logically one has to conclude that we're looking at the same phenomenon. Now, on top of this, with DMT, what is less known about DMT is DMT has been discovered in the blood, human blood. It has also been found as traces inside brain material, human brain material. And recently there has been a receptor site found in the brain called the TARS receptor, trace amine receptor site. And this trace amine receptor site is like a key in a lock. The receptor site is a lock and you need a key to open it. The key is DMT. It's actually designed to work with DMT. Now, if this is the case, it means that DMT is endogenous. It is created by the brain itself. Indeed, one has to ask the question as to why DMT exists in the natural world. It's in nearly everything. This is a very natural substance. So what is it about DMT? Is DMT the spirit molecule, as Rick Strassman says, in which case it is the way in which we can experience the greater reality that we are denied? Now, effectively, you may or may not be aware of the work of people like Henri Bergson, who was a French philosopher. And Henri Bergson argued that the brain is an attenuator. The brain is something that actually minimizes the amount of perceptions we have, because if we saw everything, it would be overload. And what the brain does is it just selects information and it presents it to consciousness. What dimethyltryptamine does is it opens up the valve, the perceiving valve, for you to perceive reality as it really is. Now, I believe that this can actually happen under normal circumstances, and when it does, you become schizophrenic, because what is happening is your world is too great. Now, we know that there's definitely extremes of dopamine in the brain with schizophrenia. I would suggest that within schizophrenia, what's happening as well is a lot of dimethyltryptamine being released in the brain. Now, as you pointed out, the pineal gland seems to be the place that dimethyltryptamine can be generated within the human brain. Now, what you may or may not be aware of again is that, and I've read this from various sources, is that the pineal gland in the embryo at the 49th day of gestation, the pineal gland is at the back of the throat. And after the 49th day of its inception, it moves up to the centre of the brain. Now, the 49th day of inception is when the Buddhists say that we become a human being. Up until then, we are not. It's when the soul comes in. If this is the case, it means that the pineal gland, there's been arguments to say the pineal gland has left a little, as it moves up, leaves a little bit of a duct at the back of the throat. When it excretes dimethyltryptamine, bits of dimethyltryptamine trip down the back of the throat, giving a very, very peculiar acidic taste. Now, if you talk to people who go into deep meditative states, they regularly state that they have this divine nectar state, this taste that they feel when they go into alternate states of consciousness. Is this dimethyltryptamine dripping down the back of the throat from the pineal gland? Now, in my next book, I'll be putting a model together to try and explain neurologically exactly what is happening here. And again, I'm doing the science, I'm doing the neurology, and I'm doing the particle physics. And I think this can be linked to something you touched upon earlier on, I think, with the ORC-R model of Stuart Hamerhoff and Roger Penrose. And the idea that within the brains itself and within the structures of the brain, there are tiny things called microtubules. And these can draw up information from alternate universes, from something called a zero-point field.
Kada već spominjemo epifizu i DMT, zanimljiv je podatak tog profesora psihijatrije sa Medicinskog fakulteta u Meksiku, Rika Strassmana, da zapravo u trenutku smrti epifiza luči DMT, što također opet ima veze sa izvantjelesnim iskustvima koje zovemo iskustva bliska smrti i slično. I sve se to na neki način povezuje i zapravo neki ljudi pokušavaju sve svesti na biološku komponentu, drugi pokušavaju na duhovnu, no ipak se čini da su te dvije stvari nekako umrežene. Ono što se događa u duhovnom na neki način jest stimulirano kemijom i biologijom našeg tijela. No završimo ovih zadnjih par minuta emisije upravo fizičarem Rogerom Penroseom i anesteziologom Stuartom Hamerhoffom, koji se pitao jedno zapravo banalno pitanje. Gdje svijest odlazi za vrijeme anestezije? Jer usprkos tome što se anestezija koristi, niko zapravo ne zna točno kako radi. Dobro pitanje, ne spavaš, ne sanjaš, mozak ti radi, ti živiš, a opet svijesti nema. Toga je dovelo naravno do suradnje sa tim fizičarom Penroseom i spominjali ste već neke dijelić njihovih istraživanja. Međutim, tu još treba uvesti nekoliko pojmova. Što su oni pridonijeli, koliko razumijevanja ovih fenomena sa idejama koje još uvijek i jesu i nisu u potpunosti prihvaćene, ali sigurno je da koračuju svojim putem prema naprijed.
Roger Penrose is I think he's the Rouse Ball Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge. Might be at Oxford, I always get the two places muddled up. But suffice to say, he's a world-renowned mathematician and mathematical physicist. And he, for a long time, has been intrigued by consciousness, how consciousness comes about within the systems of the brain. And as you rightly say, Stuart Hamerhoff is a consultant anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona. And he has been long fascinated by what happens when an anesthetic hits the brain, because as you say, we just disappear, consciousness disappears, it wipes consciousness out. So he started looking into structures of the brain, and he has found that there are, within the neurons of the brain, the structures that actually hold the neurons of the brain together, for want of a better term, the framework of the neurons, are something called microtubules. And microtubules in structure consist of two lines of tubulin. And these lines of tubulin, it seems, give off light. Again, they give off light, and by firing light together, they cause interference patterns. Now, there are literally billions of microtubules in each neuron. There are billions of neurons within the brain. So therefore, what they believe is happening is that these microtubules are so small that subatomic effects, what I was talking about earlier on about the collapse of the wave function and everything else, subatomic behavior can affect consciousness. Now, this is a very important point, because one of the great mysteries of quantum physics is the point that quantum effects, the quantum world of particles being in two places at the same time and everything else, ceases to work, and the world that we all understand that works, the Newtonian world of cause and effect. They believe that the point where those two come together, the nexus point, is consciousness, and that consciousness is a manifestation of quantum behavior. Now, I've recently found that you can take this one step further back, because within the microtubules themselves, there's something called a microtrabecular trellis. And these are actually trillions of tiny filaments that actually make up the microtubules. So you can extrapolate further and into smaller sizes towards the quantum world. So your brain at the moment is drawing up information from the quantum field, from the quantum world. This is exactly what Tom Campbell argues as well, but we're coming from slightly different angles on this. But effectively, it seems that consciousness, we're trying to measure consciousness using Newtonian physics, when we should be trying to understand consciousness using quantum physics. Now, the big argument is, and Max Tegmark is one of the main guys on this, the guy I mentioned earlier on with the quantum suicide experiment. And Max Tegmark argues that the brain is too hot and wet for these kind of effects to happen. In other words, the reason that what's called orchestrated reduction, the ORC-R theory of Penrose and Hamerhoff doesn't work because the brain is too wet and hot. But I was thinking about this recently, and I was thinking, well, heat is energy. It's the vibration between particles. When you get down to those sizes, you're in a vacuum. The particles have nothing between them. And a vacuum cannot have heat in it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but if somebody can correct me on this, but the very point of a vacuum is that there's no energy. And if there's no energy, it means it's effectively in a state of 0 point. In which case, this is where then the whole idea of 0 point energy comes up, because 0 point energy is energy that is manifest at absolute zero, 273.14 degrees Kelvin, I think. And there should be no energy, but they discover there is energy there, even though there shouldn't be. And this is energy coming up from the field that Lynn McTaggart talks about and other people talk about. It's the 0 point field. Irving Laszlo talks about it in his books. This is where consciousness is drawn up from. This is where everything is encoded digitally.
Gospodine Peake, hvala. Ne bih htio biti prorok, ali mislim da ćemo se za koji mjesec opet družiti. I sretan put gdje god ste se naumili ići. A što se nas tiče, koliko god pričali, ništa ne može ipak zamijeniti iskustva. Izvantjelesno iskustvo još uvijek se nalazi prilično izvan toga što obuhvaća naša dogovorena stvarnost i suvremeno shvaćanje ustrojstva svijeta. Pa još uvijek većina ljudi naravno smatra da ne mogu jednostavno napustiti tijelo i lutati nekim vanjskim svijetom, te da je svijest tvorevina mozga alocirana u mozgu i slično, ali kad jednom naslutite da svijest može postojati izvan mozga, vrijeme je za doista veliko preslagivanje. Optimisti bi rekli da su sve ovo naznake nove paradigme koje u stvaranju, a naravno nijedno rođenje nije potpuno bezbolni proces. Pa vrijedi staviti koju kunu na okolicu da će sljedeći katalizator biti upravo probe u razumijevanju prirode svijesti. Sa svim čudnim implikacijama koje se mogu svesti na tvrdnju da ono što smatramo stvarnošću možda uopće nije ono što vjerujemo da jest. U odnosu na ono sve što vidimo oko sebe, to bi svakako trebalo biti dobra vijest, a zato mogu s punim opravdanjem reći laka vam noć.